So I always think it's important to take a look and say, is this a problem or not? And just take a look. So when you look at deaths due to and the reasons why, and you look at different ages, when you're looking at teenagers, unintentional injuries continue to cause the greatest number of deaths. But then look, unfortunately, suicide is now the second leading cause of death for teenagers. Next slide. And if you take a look at these leading causes of death and the mechanisms, unfortunately, look in the teenage years, the ones that are circled, unintentional motor vehicle collisions are always number one, but look at 3 and 4 are firearm-related deaths. Next slide. And when you take a look at our country compared to other countries, the United States accounts for 91% of children killed by guns in all high-income countries. So this isn't something that we cannot prevent, because other countries seem to be doing a great job. How can we do a better job within the United States? Next slide. And when you take a look, so I think it's important to look at some of these numbers that this is an astronomical problem. So for the clinicians that are on this and they see this every day, this might be new information for the non-clinicians. But if you look at deaths alone, they're up close to 50% since 2013 due to suicide. It's about 1 death every 3 hours. And if you look at, unfortunately, even younger kids are committing suicide, where there's an 80% increase in children less than 14 years of age. And then you want to look at non-fatal injuries. Since 2007, ER visits are up about 329%. I could tell you within my own emergency department, when I started about 25 years ago, we had about 300 visits a year for mental health problems. We have about 700 to 800 every month right now. And all mental health disorders are up about 60%. Next slide. In Ohio, it's no different. So when you take a look at suicides in Ohio, we have an increase of close to 28% of suicides in Ohio from 2010 to 2019. And you can take a look. This occurs all throughout the state. It's not isolated in just one region. It happens everywhere. Next slide. When you look at gun ownership, about half of homes have a firearm, which accounts for about 200 million guns. In Ohio alone, about 37% of families report to have a firearm, and unfortunately, close to 50% keep them unlocked and available to children. And sadly, of the youth who completed suicide by firearm, 82% used a gun from the home. Next slide. And it's really important for you to recognize that this is not just children with mental health problems. If you survey teens at any given time, 25% of teens are depressed. And so at any given time, if you poll them, a child will have symptoms of depression or anxiety. And as a result, it's not just labeling kids with psychiatric diagnosis, it's really all teens that we have to be concerned about. Next slide. I figured I would just give a 1-minute blurb about, I have my own personal story, and, you're going to hear about Logan's and Melissa's later on. But, my son was, he's 24 today. He was always a little bit quirky. He had decent relationships, and he was a good student, cross-country runner. And after he broke up with his girlfriend, he spiraled and had a lot of problems. We had many nights where he was up all night. He was expressing thoughts of wanting to hurt himself. And as an ER physician with every resource available to me, I still had questions of, where do I go? Do I go to the emergency room? What do I do when he has these outbursts? What are some of the coping skills that I can work and work with? So hopefully today, when you hear from Emily and you hear some of these stories, some of these might touch home to you, and hopefully you'll learn these resources of what you can use if you have this situation or you have a friend or neighbor with this situation. Next slide. And the bottom line is the store it safe is important. We need to keep lethal means out of the risk of teenagers. When you look at the time elapsed between decision and attempt, they interviewed survivors and they found 25% made an attempt within 5 minutes, 50% within 20 minutes, and 71% within 1 hour. So if you think about it, if we can make it so they don't have the lethal means within that 1 hour, and we can work on these coping skills, we could make a difference. And that's really the basis for the Stewart Safe program. Next slide.
Here to talk about like, what can you do? Like, what can you do to prepare? What can you do to kind of address this when kids do come to your clinic or families do come to your practice to talk about these things? And I also was watching the chat and seeing that there was a lot of talk about, it's that you weren't a failure, but I 100% would agree that I would have felt the same way. And it can happen to anybody's kids. So let's talk about what we can do. So move forward a slide, please. One of the quintessential pieces of parenting is to keep the babies alive, through nutrition, through safety, through, teaching them to be independent adults. That's kind of what we're wired to do. So kind of thinking about safety, identifying risk. And then when you do identify it, manage what you need to do with it and develop a plan are really the key points of what we're going to talk about. In a safety plan, there's restricting access to lethal means, increasing supervision and communication strategies, but we're also going to talk about something that's not historically included in safety planning, but some other coping strategies that can be used in the moment. Next slide. Whether or not you're trained with how to do this or feel very confident with mental health or psychiatric issues, the most important thing you can offer is hope, empathy, use the same language. Like, as the provider, the pediatrician, you're committed to this child's health, and partner with the family, partner with the child. These are all skills that are related to motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy. Lots of different factors kind of weigh in. And Lawrence Wisso is a pediatrician and child psychiatrist who coined the term common factors and created this help mnemonic that helps guide conversations that are very difficult. It gives you kind of a framework to use. And when someone offers this information to you, like they've felt suicidal, taking it seriously, even if it's mentioned in jest or as a passing comment. The kids are testing. They want to know if you're going to take them seriously, or if they should be talking about this with you or not. And just acknowledge like if it was distressing, how distressing it was, or how brave they were for letting you know. But really that your goal, no matter what, is this patient's safety sitting in front of you. And the National Association for Mental Illness is an organization of people with mental illness and families as well that support them. And they came up with these principles or tips on how to engage with teens. Teens are not easy for adults. It's a tough crowd, but it's actually one of my favorites to talk to. But the idea of how to engage them, I think as pediatricians, we often get into a very quick kind of fast pace, and it's easier to get information from parents about what their interests are, and they're the ones guiding the patient's care directly. But when it's a teenager, engage them during the visit. Pull them in, ask them questions directly, ask them about how they want to be communicated with. Often people in this age group don't feel heard. And then offer information. This is like the tool that we have that they need. And especially when someone offers that they have had thoughts of suicide, it's always important to emphasize that there's always a choice and you do not have to act on the thought. Thoughts do go away, and you kind of ride the wave of when they come up and when they come down, but there's things that we can do. Next slide. So the idea of safety planning is, it's not a contract, but it's safety planning, is to anticipate that bad things can happen, or tough conversations, problems, pandemics can happen when you don't expect it to. And it's so much easier to think when you're not in crisis. When you're in crisis, literally the part of your brain that is functioning is not the thinking part. So now that we're not in crisis in this office right now, let's talk about what we can do should crisis happen. And as Dr. Gittleman mentioned, the suicide attempts are often extremely impulsive. And if you remember adolescent brains, that prefrontal cortex, which is the brakes to the amygdala, the emotion emitter, hasn't quite developed all the way yet. So they're still learning how to make decisions and how to make good judgments. But what we really want to do is help. Some of these strategies are involved to delay the access to something that could be potentially irreversible, but also to arm them with things that they can do to help bring that dysregulated state back down to regulation so they can start using that thinking part of the brain again. Next slide. So with the safety plan, we talk about restricting access. So the first thing, restrict access to lethal means. The lock boxes, I think, are amazing because they hold more than just guns. You can put lots of stuff in them. And you can get different kinds of these things that have locks on it. But the idea is not to create a challenge for the teen or the kid. It's actually to say, hey, I want there to be as much time between you and this thing that could potentially kill you. To give it time for that 20 minutes where half of the kids have attempted, or that hour long where 70% of the kids have attempted. Give it time to kind of bring down that emotional dysregulation. And then offering information to the parents about things that can make that decision-making worse, like alcohol, drugs, anything that can disinhibit a child further. Again, focusing on safety. And next slide. And I think I'm a little bit concerned about my time, but the communication strategies is, it's actually like a contingency plan, so to speak. So your goal is to kind of tease out, if you can, if you have time to tease out, what kind of triggers are happening, what situations are perpetuating the suicidality or kind of putting the child at the highest risk, and asking kids very directly, like, what was going on the last time, and did you tell anyone? Does anybody know? How did it stop? I think Logan did a wonderful job of what we would consider to be a self-interrupted suicide attempt. Like there was something there that made them stop, and then asking, like, what helped you make that decision? And that was a life-saving decision that you made. And there's lots of protective factors that are usually pulled out when kids offer that information, because that's going to be critical to developing a very specific safety plan for this child that's going to be helpful and meaningful. The idea of name three. Some people are familiar with like 3 people they can go to. Often the kids will say the parent or the caregiver in the room, and it's important to make them think outside that box, because that's a very socially acceptable canned answer. And it's usually, or sometimes the parent or the caregiver that's implying the rules that is triggering the distress in the first place. So you have to kind of make sure that they're able to kind of come up with more than just one person. And if they can't, there's some resources at the end that we can go over as well, or at least be introduced to. And then the idea of like, just, okay, so what if you're at your friend's house? What if you're at school? These are conversations to have like with the patient, but also with the family too, you can have as well. And there's some more resources too. Go ahead and go forward. So the pieces that are involved with kind of the overall plan. So we have the safety plan of the restricting lethal means, increasing the adult supervision, and coming up with communication strategies. The other parts of this management is like identifying those impairments, either, from, you can advance it. I think it actually has some pieces. Just go ahead and go for it. Yeah, there you go. Treating anxiety and depression and poor impulse control, because as we know, depression is not the only thing that leads to suicide. Maybe 30 to 40% of the cases have that being a primary mental health diagnosis. helping them with positive coping strategies, I think, is going to be the biggest preventive piece we can do as pediatricians and as parents and caregivers of kids. Helping them with this emotional regulation piece, helping them with depression, doing one thing that they can do to help their brain recover, because it's a disorder. It actually is causing a tremendous amount of dysfunction and impairment, even anxiety, impairment in social functioning. And social functioning, that connectedness is such a huge part of improving and protecting yourself from the risk of suicide. Integrating how to manage distress, but actually specifically asking the kid, what would be an ideal way someone could help you if the thoughts of dying would return? And often kids tell me that the parents are asking them every 5 minutes, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? And that may not work for that child. And so asking them, what would actually, having the parent or the caregiver with them, what would be helpful for you, I think is a very powerful way to kind of get a very effective safety plan. And the idea that it can change over time, like having a text system, having a thumbs up system, having a journal, something like that, that is just creatively outside the box, is really where the kid is going to be the expert. And sitting in, asking them to sit in the room, not be isolated. So when you're isolated, it reinforces the suicidal thinking, because there's just nothing to distract you at that point. So what can you do instead? You can have the door open. You can have just be able to go in a room and sit down, not have anybody talk to you, because again, you're distressed, you're dysregulated, you don't want to have a lot of questions asked of you at that moment. You may not even have the words, which is 90% of the time. The kids don't know how to articulate what is going on. They just need somebody there. And the parent and the caregiver is such an important buffer in those situations. And knowing the child, knowing when they're kind of feeling okay and thinking again, it's I really like that you sat down with me. And if there's anything that you want to talk about, I'm actually curious, what do you be interested in what they're thinking about, be interested in what they're interested in. Next slide. Some of the great self-management things that one of the Store It Safe program offers that Dr. Denny's going to get more detail with is, what do you do as a parent, but also as the kid themselves if they're having thoughts? How can we teach them healthy coping strategies to manage distress? Distress is never going to go away. It's how we approach it is what we can change. And having these different techniques, there's a myriad of techniques, but this is kind of what therapy, a part of what therapy is doing, is helping you understand how to get back to that regulating brain piece and how to have these different strategies to approach it. And rhythm is incredibly important. Repetition, rhythm, predictability. These are all things that kind of bring us back down. That's why music, I think, is one of the most powerful coping strategies on a fundamentally neuropsychiatric level. It's amazing. The idea of the senses is another grounding component of, it's not just distracting, it's just helping you focus on something that you can do. And it just brings down the dysregulation, which helps you get back to that thinking brain again. Next slide. And I did talk about it a little bit before, but I wanted to just bring attention to, these are the factors of resilience. The pandemic has literally crossed out most of these resiliency skills and opportunities for kids. So I think just recognizing that, all of these healthy coping strategies have been shifted and adjusted and smashed with COVID. So we being creative around it. Anytime you notice when a kid is making a good choice about connecting or trying. I heard Logan talk about parenting or feeling like they needed to parent their siblings. That was amazing that was your instinct. Bravo for taking care of something, because that's incredibly important, especially when we're isolated. But thinking about ways to keep the brain healthy. That's what pediatricians can do. You need sleep, you need to eat, you need to connect with people. Those are baseline skills. At the bottom of this slide is a link to Just Breathe, which is about 4 to 6 minutes. And it's a wonderful introduction to why the deep breathing and how, literally how to get that calming pathway activated. Next slide. Yeah, this is my last slide about different resources, I think. I imagine at this point, Logan, you've heard about Trevor Project, and if you're not, please, the Trevor Project is going to be an amazing resource as well. Has really safe chat rooms that are designed for kids that are in a community where they are openly rejected and terrified to come out, or if they just need support. It's a wonderful place. There's also, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. This is actually a website I go to for these talks, and I keep going down rabbit holes of information because it's like so much great resources at your fingertips. These are like the phone numbers and the text that you can literally put in the kid's phone in your office before you even bring the parent in the room, is recommended. But on the website, you have the Trevor Project, stopbullying.gov, use suicide warning signs, lots of great information available